But this morning, we are going to continue with another issue which has truly global dimensions, and that is our environment. Unfortunately, studies have shown that this is yet another area where a gender gap exists. And we would like to use your help to narrow it down even a bit more and to see in which sub-issues the largest of such gaps exist. For this, again, please find the Tasks button next to the first panel of today and select the area where you think the largest gender gap in attitudes towards the environment exists. The options being kind of the typical ones. So we have climate change, air pollution, waste, marine and freshwater pollution, and ecosystems degradation, or maybe there's something else, maybe nuclear energy or something that doesn't fit the categories mentioned above. So take a second, look at the list and think, where do you think the biggest gender gap in attitudes exist? We currently have one answer. I hope this this doesn't stay this way. But while people are answering this, Marianne, what do you think? What could be the issue where men and women view the problems facing the planet and humankind most differently?
Yeah, I honestly have to say I have no idea, but I would probably go for climate change because it's a broader topic and discussed a lot. But yeah.
Yeah,
not sure.
And I guess with climate change also, the thing that could be somewhat different is the perception of who and how should solve it, right? So as I understand from a few studies that have looked into the climate change issue, it seems that men are more likely to rely on techno solutions and rely on governmental action rather than individual action.
Yeah.
So we have a few answers now. Seems that
people are waking up, tuning in.
Waking up, tuning in, and it seems that waste seems to be leading at the moment. So I guess here too, I guess waste management in a lot of countries has been traditionally a thing that people don't really think about much and is considered to be something that someone else needs to deal with, not me as a private citizen. And I think the same what we just discussed could also apply here, that men sort of tend to, well, stereotypically, men tend to think that waste is something that I just get rid of and someone else needs to solve it, sort it, recycle it or whatever. Yeah. Whereas I think it could be different for women who consider that waste is an issue where everybody plays a role.
Yeah, that would have been my second option after climate change.
Yeah. So waste seems to be taking a larger lead. We'll see whether this is actually true. I mean, we've been spitballing quite a few theories here, and we can see whether this actually holds any truth in it, because we'll have presenters who are much more knowledgeable on this issue.
Yes.
But I think it's time to stop the poll. I mean, if anybody still wants to answer, go ahead. But I think it's time to move on to the panel.
Yeah, let's get to the next panel, which will discuss this challenge and solutions in depth. You also have the option of asking questions from panelists via Workshop by clicking the Q&A button next to the panel item in the agenda, so please use this option. This panel session is going to be moderated by Marianne Biomet. Marianne Biomet has a PhD in sociology. Her research has addressed men and masculinities in a variety of situations. She has studied men's uptake of parental leave, as well as migrant men who follow their female partners who have international careers. She has also focused on men and the construction of masculinity in Estonian eco-communities. Thus, she has been interested in whether caring for the environment leads to caring for women and more gender equality. Marianne, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, I'm delighted to be in front of you on your screens. And Marianne, thanks for this very kind introduction. to start with, I would like to pay a compliment to the organizers of the conference for the technical setup of this conference. It's a big event, and it seems it has gone quite smoothly. And I would also like to pay a compliment for the elegant program of this conference. I really admire the broad understanding of care that the organizers have chosen for this conference, encompassing the care for women, the care for children, care for other men, as well as care for the self and the natural environment. So it's a very broad concept of care and a beautiful one. Some of the topics of this conference can be considered quite classical for conferences on men and masculinities. Latter include, for example, prevention of gender-based violence or promoting nurturing fatherhood. But some of the topics of this conference, on the other hand, are quite new. And one of these new topics is the topic of this panel that I'm leading. And the topic is caretaking for the natural environment. There are no years of research nor years of policy making in this field. So it's interesting to be here and discuss this issue because it's fairly new. Fortunately, we have some excellent panelists to discuss this fairly new issue. It is a pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Martin Holtmann as our first panelist. Martin Holtmann is an associate professor in Chalmers University of Technology, Sweden. He has published widely on energy, climate, environmental and gender issues. And he is currently co-editing a Palgrave anthology, Men, Masculinities and Earth, contending with the Manthropocene. So welcome, Martin. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Next, we have here Bob Pease, an adjunct professor at the University of Tasmania, Australia, and an honorary professor of Deakin University, Australia. He has published widely on men and masculinities, including on the topic of this panel. Maria Garcia Alonso is a member of European Commission Task Force for Equality, and her work is to make sure that equality issues are integrated in all EU policies, including climate and environmental policies. Very nice to have you here. And last but not least, we have here Katri Aavik, Associate Professor of Gender Studies at Tallinn University, as well as an animal rights and vegan movement activist. She also gave us a brilliant keynote speech yesterday. Katri, you're welcome. We start this panel with an introductory speech by Martin Holtmann, which will provide us a background for the panel discussion that will follow. Martin, you have 15 minutes. Please start.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to the organizers for bringing us together at this decisive time in history. And before I begin, I want to recognize the importance of different sisterhoods of brilliant ecofeminists I've been fortunate to be invited to and supported by. So thank you first, Sherilyn McGregor, Susan Buckingham, Sema Roy Johnson, Annika Kronzell, Greta Gard, and many more. Without you, I would not have been able to develop my own thinking and analysis in the way that I've done. If we zoom out and reason about our planet as a whole, we can today get a grasp on an ecocidal logic at the end of Anthropocene, the period in which a small group, mostly of men, thought they could rule the world and conquer it. Our late Manthropocene, a concept proposed by Giovanna Di Ciro, is filled with huge challenges. The ones I will briefly address today are the challenges I've researched and written about using my interdisciplinary scholarship training in energy, environment, science, and technology, history, sociology, gender, and culture studies. The first and foremost challenge that quite many sometimes are unaware of is energy, not least exposed by Cara Daggett in her article Petro-Masculinity that came out a couple of years ago. Globally, we are 83% dependent on gas, oil, and coal in our economies, meaning that almost every aspect of industrial modern life is drenched with fossil fuels, which is, when burned, creating greenhouse gases that gives our Earth fever, a phenomena also called climate change. If we are to survive as a species, all known oil, gas, and coal needs to stay in the ground as of today. Climate change, then, is not happening up there in the sky. It is actually happening down here on the surface of Earth. What is important to notice is that it is the circulation of water that changes with climate change when humans burn carbon from dead animals and plants that has been compressed for millions of years. Our human life depends on the ways in which different forms of water can take, such as snow, ice, mists, oceans, and drinking water. This is eloquently described by Strida Neymaris in her work on hydrofeminism. When we give our Earth fever, we create droughts, stronger storms, heavier rainfalls, more devastating winds, and deadly forest fires, not least experienced by Bob Peace in Australia a couple of months ago, and thereby shifting life chances for humans and more than humans alike drastically. With Me Too and Black Lives Matter, the damaging power inequalities have once again been exposed, which is also exposed in the time of climate change. This has a long tradition within critical studies of men and masculinities, of which, for example, Jeff Hearn's works are great examples. This has exposed the challenge to human well-being of when inequalities is part of societies. And it's even more challenging today when authoritarian ideology spread its toxic message around the globe. That was discussed in one of the panels around social media yesterday. A consequence of the unequal power structures is the unfair distribution of money, food, influence, and so forth. Social scientists and humanities scholars, among them Thomas Piketty, show how 1% is getting richer and richer and the rest becomes relatively poorer in our area. A trend accelerating as we speak during the pandemic, with, for example, the world richest, Jeff Bezos, increasing his wealth by 25% the last couple of months. It is also this 1% of the richest, almost all cis men, who are responsible for funding the climate chaos that we're in with own investments and also are answerable for these type of investments, such as the CEO, Jamie Dimon at Chase Bank. This is a phenomenon described by many, for example, Raven Connell, with the concept of business masculinities. If we then go to the state-of-the-art publications in earth sciences, they are in a very humble academic way screaming out the message to us that our planet is fast approaching various tipping points for crucial ecosystems, such as Siberia, which has seen an average of 2 or 3 higher degrees this summer and continuously forest fires. We see the melting of the ice of Greenland. We see the forest fires in Amazonas. And from my own environmental history archival research, I know that this knowledge is not something new. Politicians and industry leaders have broadly known this risk for over 30 years. And these persons, almost only men, are now getting old, and many are dealing with this guilt of inaction and spreading climate change denial as a consequence of that guilt. One existential risk that is exposed by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is science denial. In many instances, denial of our climate emergency and denial of COVID-19 overlap. The most obvious examples are the Trump and Bolsonaro governments in the US and Brazil, who said this was only a little flu when it began. And the consequences for their population are devastating. The most obvious science denial that is the problem is also a large challenge connected to that of implicatory denial or response denial. These forms of denial, meaning that the challenges and the problems are recognized, but solutions that are totally meaningless, ineffective, or contradictory are used. This is revealed by the astonishing work of Kari Norgard in her book Living in Denial. Very much recommended work. A challenge in late Anthropocene, following De Shiro, is that existing laws nationally and globally supports an extractivist way in which resources ought to be used for human purposes, in a linear way from source to waste. If that are used to human purposes in a linear way from source to waste. Changing to circular economies needs shifting laws to recognizing human and nature entanglements, values and practices still alive with indigenous peoples and codified in, for example, Bolivian and Ecuadorian laws or rights of nature. If changes in values and enactments by men needs support structure, my judgment is, from historical evidence, is that laws needs to change. Now, zooming in on how these challenges of humanity are connected to the specific problems of masculinities discussed at this conference, my research the last 20 years have exposed the need for changing male norms and enactments to deal with these bigger challenges of humanity. We see, for example, as I was touching upon earlier, that there is a large group of persons enacting what I've called in my research industrial breadwinner masculinities, connected to the history of industrial modernization, not least to fossil fuels extractivism. They are most explicitly shown among those who turn against women-led climate justice and indigenous-led rights of nature movements around the globe, as well as when we see people spreading climate change denial. In the hate speech and threats against, for example, Greta Thunberg and the murders of environmental movement leaders, industrial breadwinner enactments show their toxic face. But as we know from the pyramid of violence against women, this is only the top of a much larger, what I would call, fossil-fueled patriarchal system. The other form of masculinities I've researched is the greenwashed eco-modern masculinities. Men who recognize the challenge we are facing, but with every possible technique trying to avoid system changes. This is what I call response or implicatory climate change denial of our ecological emergency. My most clear example of this of today is Elon Musk, a person who poses as an environmental hero, but in various ways use end-of-pipe technologies to conserve the transportation system and use all of his surplus money and gain from his Tesla operations to find ways to departure from a burned out Earth in a spaceship, leaving the rest of us behind. I've concluded from my historical and contemporary empirical research that a much larger and much deeper change in values and enactments are needed. This is what I, together with Paul Poulet, called ecological masculinities. We base this conceptual and praxis-oriented theory, as Kadri Avik explained in her well-performed introduction to this conference, on ecofeminist knowledges, material feminist ontologies, and queer ecology scholarship. Today, I will not go into the theoretical details here, but instead just briefly say some words about our leadership training that I've developed together with feminist organization Men for Gender Equality in Sweden, which is based on our theory of ecological masculinities. The organization Men for Gender Equality was founded in Sweden 30 years ago, and 2015 recognized that violence against women and nature overlap. They then started to use this insight to bring about change in masculinities norms in pursuit of gender equality and pro-environmental behavior concurrently. Why is this important? First, climate denial is most prevalent among men, not least older men, and more by men than women. Secondly, the category of men still holds societal power, which is a problem if they don't recognize our climate emergency. Thirdly, men are overrepresented at fossil fuel-based workplaces, as car industry, as well as extractive industry, for example, coal mining, which turn out to be a problem when these type of jobs needs to go or transform, as discussed by, for example, Michael Flood. Our leadership training of ecological masculinities is a long-term, in-depth collaboration effort between academia and civil societies. It takes place in a series of 8 reflective groups that men have encouraged to embrace the severity of the ongoing global ecological crisis, express feelings about it, reflect on their role in ecological degradation, and find diverse ways to contribute to positive change. The groups have explored how they can choose reciprocity and care in the making of an equal and sustainable world without violence. This leadership training is codified in a printed handbook, free to download and test. Currently, we are evaluating this. An assessment has been published in English as a master thesis in a journal article in Sweden and is about to be published as an anthology chapter. Finally, the challenge we are part of in late Anthropocene is, from an interdisciplinary perspective as mine, enormous and sometimes hard to even comprehend. When knowledges from complementary scholarship and various disciplines are brought together, the image that presents itself is that of humanity creating an ecocidal logic with the forecasted consequences of a near extinction of us as a species. This is where the research results are at the moment. This is then neither a gender issue or even a masculinities challenge alone, but it is my judgment that our work with changing norms and praxis connected to dominant forms of masculinities could make a difference. But this change needs to go with fast transformation in power, laws, wealth, and values, thereby leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for this overview. Now I would like to give the floor to our panelists. You all heard what Martin was telling us. What are your first reactions to it? Who would like to start? Okay, Marina, please.
I'm happy to start. First of all, I'm very happy to be here, so thank you for the invitation. It is a very interesting presentation from Martin. I'm happy that he already highlighted the critical situation that we're facing in terms of climate change and environmental degradation, which is why this discussion that we're having today is so relevant. Something needs to be done, and we all need to take part in it, including men. He also raises very relevant points for the work of the Commission in terms of mainstreaming gender into our climate policies. Indeed, we see that in Europe, men and women contribute differently to greenhouse gas emissions, and research shows that these differences are based on gender roles expressed then in behavior and consumption patterns. So I'm very happy that we're having this conversation today to look further into this, and well, today focusing more on men's behavior and attitudes, and hopefully reach some conclusions on how to best address it. And also very happy that Martin emphasized the point that this is an interdisciplinary issue, that those of us that work on climate policy need to be open also to these discussions on gender. So very happy that the panel is taking place and look forward to the discussion.
Bob, would you continue?
Yes, look, I think Martin's given us a really excellent overview of the problems we face, and he's emphasised really importantly the role that masculinity, dominant forms of masculinity, play in perpetuating those problems. And I think he's really spot on when he identifies the way in which hegemonic forms of masculinity also contribute to climate change denial. A couple of things I perhaps would add. One is I think that we have a lot to learn from feminist approaches to science, and I think that that what they remind us is that climate change science itself is sometimes part of the problem, with its focus on very technocratic and masculinist approaches to environmental problems, and I think it's worth reflecting on that particularly as well. The other thing I would say by way of introduction is that that as this is not only a problem to do with changes in ecosystems, that it is deeply embedded in social structure, I would want to talk about not only the link between environmental problems and dominant forms of masculinity, but also of the relationship with capitalism, with colonialism, and with patriarchy, and how these structural dimensions of the problem are present as well. And so, in talking about masculinity, let's not lose sight of these broader structural issues. And I think that some of the work that's happening at the moment with critical green criminology has made some important contributions here, because they focus on the role that corporations play in perpetuating most of the environmental problems we face. And of course, those corporations are largely run by Western white upper class men. So, so I just want to keep that structural dimension in place in our discussions as well. So thank you. But an excellent introduction and overview.
Thank you for this comment. Now we have Kadri waiting for your comment to the introductory speech we had.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I also thought it was really insightful. I really appreciate it. And maybe I'll highlight a few things that I thought were particularly useful. I think you really nicely highlighted the power inequalities in the context of climate change, and really this taking an intersectional perspective. I think it's really important to understand climate change and its social implications. So the questions of who caused it and still causes it the most, who suffers from it, from the consequences most, and who should be maybe more responsible for mitigating it. So that's crucial. And I also really appreciated your critique of this sort of greenwashing, that eco-modern approach or masculinities, who tend to be these privileged men. And as you pointed out, they are really focusing on the kind of techno fixes, but ultimately they are not challenging capitalism and social inequalities. So these structures that Bob just also highlighted. So actually all this activity may further increase inequalities, and it often really kind of gets presented as some kind of form of care towards the earth or the humanity by these men. And I think, as you really highlighted, I think we should really also point this out more in media discussions and really frame it as a kind of a climate change denial. And maybe also to say that I think it's really important to understand more the links between the climate change denial and hegemonic masculinity, like how they are interlinked. So you pointed out that especially there are some older men who tend to be the climate change deniers, but what other characteristics do they have, and like how are these men positioned? Like to learn more about them, what motivates them, because I think it's really hard to believe that this is just a kind of ignorance. So if anything, it's kind of strategic or willful ignorance, and denying climate change serves the interests of these men somehow, probably. And kind of when thinking about this climate change denial, I think we can bring a parallel to this current another denial of scientific knowledge and lack of care towards others, which manifests itself in the denial of realities of COVID-19. So we actually know that there are particularly older men who are more likely to develop a severe form of coronavirus, and also death rates are higher among men. But at the same time, we also know there are some recent studies that are being done that men are more reluctant to wear masks and kind of finding it shameful or a sign of weakness. And so I think there are important parallels to be drawn here, like who are these climate deniers and the deniers of COVID-19 realities. I think this could be explored further. But thank you for the good introduction to our panel.
Let's move on with this panel. I have prepared a question. Well, the studies show that men are the ones that exhaust and exploit the natural environment more than women do. And at the same time, men that refrain from doing so, such as vegan men, as Kadri discussed yesterday, are seen as soft and feminine. So there seems to be a mismatch between masculinity and taking care of the nature. And now comes my question. How to make these two things better compatible? It seems to me that there could be two approaches, two ways forward. Should we either rebrand environmentally responsible behavior as tough and masculine? Or should we rather strive to reconstruct masculinity so that it would include care for non-human life? So what are your reflections? Which strategy would be more promising? And perhaps let's start with Martin this time.
It's a good question. I've seen this research from media scholars as well as from psychology. And here they tend to think that we should kind of rebrand so that environmental behavior fits more the dominant masculinity. From my perspective, historically, that hasn't worked. So this way of thinking things is within environmental history called ecological modernization. I call it eco-modern discourse. And my concept of eco-modern masculinities is actually highlighting how this has been for 30 years a way to greenwash certain technologies and certain consumption as green. And reading from the history here, I think that's a dead end. We need to change much deeper and in another type of way.
Bob, do you agree with Martin or disagree?
Yes, I absolutely agree with the problems of bringing green behaviour in line with traditional masculinity. And sadly, in Australia, the Green political party here has gone down that route. Since particularly there was a change of leadership from a woman to two men in recent times, the Green political party in this country has become much more masculinist, and they believe they have to take that strategy to recruit more men into environmental and sustainability projects. And I agree with Martin fully that it's a dead end, because if the only way to recruit more men into sustainability is to rebrand in green behaviour as in traditional masculine ways, then we're becoming part of the same problem. But at the same time, I actually think the other strategy is also problematical too, which is to transform green behaviour into a new form of masculinity, whether we talk about ecological or caring or sustainable masculinity, because I think that the danger with this particular approach is that it then means that when men care and when men engage in compassion and empathy and sustainability and become vegans and become concerned about the environment, it becomes a masculine mode of caring. And I've even heard, and I was reflecting when Kadri was giving her wonderful presentation yesterday, I was reflecting on how I've heard some vegan men say, in contrast to the notion that real men eat meat, to argue that real men are vegans and that meat eaters are pussies. And so some of the ways in which I've seen masculinity kind of transforming and changing is all about still affirming in men a particular kind of gendered identity. And if we start naming caring behaviours as forms of masculinity, albeit social, reconstructed forms, we're still reinforcing a gender binary. And given that there's a hierarchy between forms of masculinity and forms of femininity, I can't conceive of any form of masculinity that won't end up reproducing that gender binary. So I see a problem in that direction as well. And I think there's a third alternative. And the third alternative is to foster in men a feminist ethic of care. And so all of the kinds of behaviours that we would see as part of ecological and caring masculinities, I think we actually do need to foster in men. But I don't think we need to brand them as masculine in any form. I think we need to encourage in men a greater sense of ontological vulnerability, an embodied and relational sense of self, greater compassion, greater empathy and caring. Men need to take a fairer share of responsibility for domestic care, and we need to work in solidarity with women. But why do we have to frame it as a form of ecological or caring masculinity? I see that as a problematical way forward.
Really interesting. Perhaps we continue now with Kadri and then Marina.
Yeah, I think we should emphasize kind of that environmentally sustainable values and practices are something that we should really all adopt as human beings, and that they should not be seen as like feminine. And this is really urgent in this era of the Anthropocene where we're in. And really, we should really expand the definitions of masculinity in such a way that, caring for the environment, for non-human beings would be an important part of masculinity, and definitely challenge those who see some men as less masculine for certain environmentally friendly values and practices. And also it's important for men themselves to challenge this. And in some ways, I think we are already seeing some of this. I see, and I think that more and more men and groups of men are displaying some environmentally conscious behaviors, which are in some ways becoming more mainstream, but still they are kind of small groups of men. For instance, men who challenge this kind of car culture, which is quite masculine. They give up cars and they commit by cycling in cities. So that's becoming more visible. Who give up about in my study. So these practices are more and more spilling over to the main, so perhaps maybe too slowly. That means that our attitudes towards such men are changing too. And to kind of link this to my own study, the vegan men in my study actually did not perceive that others question their masculinity. Well, this could be for different reasons also, because they are other quite privileged men in terms of their social position, and they didn't really perceive their own masculinity as under threat. So they were able to kind of negotiate this, care that they show towards the other animals and environment with their masculinity. But I think what maybe someone suggested too in the comments, I was able to see the comments to my talk and questions yesterday that was really insightful, that maybe veganism actually fits with some traditional forms of masculinity. Like there are these elements of strictness or radicalness in there that align with these traditional ideas of masculinity. So in some ways, Yes, and then as Bob as well highlighted here, that some kind of men can preserve this hegemonic masculinity, like saying that real men are vegans, sort of. So it doesn't always lead to this like rethinking of masculinity, really. There's another point that I kind of wanted to make. I think, again, intersectionality is really important, and I think for some more privileged men, but maybe Western urban, it's much easier for other men to adopt mentally conscious practices like going vegan or recycling, and they're masculinely threatened by this, and maybe it is even bolstered by their kind of class privilege. And indeed, actually, there are examples of like quite prominent and privileged men, for example, leaders of environmental or animal rights organizations, quite large organizations in the US and elsewhere, who really enjoy privileges and their kind of work in these fields that are maybe normally seen as it's really compatible, may even strengthen their masculinity. But for other men who do not enjoy these class and race privileges, it may be somehow harder to incorporate some environmentally friendly practices in their lives, which are considered feminine. So I think it's kind of quite a complex picture here in terms of like who can and who incorporates what practices and how they are judged by other people. Yeah.
It's a complex field. Marina, what is your take on it? How to solve this issue? How can men feel adequately masculine and at the same time respect the nature and take good care of it? What would be a good strategy to your mind?
I don't think I have a precise answer on what is the ideal strategy. I think from what has been discussed up to now, it's clear that it's not an easy problem to solve. I must say also, I agree to, I think it was pointed out by Bob that maybe there's a third way out of it. And we don't necessarily need to see both things as an either or options of rebranding either masculinity or environmental behavior. I also wonder if there's a way or a good way out of it would be, I think also linked to what Kari was saying, to rebrand environmental behavior in a way that it is not necessarily linked to masculinity, but still engages more men. So just that it becomes a thing that is important for everyone. Everyone can feel like they have a role to play in it without it being necessarily making it a masculine thing in the traditional way that we understand masculinity. But again, this is something that I was very happy to hear the opinions of the others on, because I think we need, from the side of the institutions, to listen to more the researchers and experts in the field. So I just want to encourage further conversation on this topic, and I'll get to it later. But it also, I think, brings us to reflect from the institutional side what we think about doing in this regard. And I'm thinking up to now, I think the examples of what we have been thinking into doing are more towards, let's say, associating environmentally friendly behavior with a more traditional masculine role. So it is something maybe that we have to reconsider. I have seen examples on this, on, for example, documentaries that highlight or try to bring, Kari probably, I don't know if I've mentioned already, examples of athletes that are vegan, and in that sense, it is more of a traditional way of making the idea of environmentally friendly behavior masculine. So I don't have the answer, but definitely take it as a point for reflection for our own work.
I found the suggestion that perhaps we shouldn't see taking care of masculinity of nature as something masculine, which brings up the question to which I would like to direct to Martin Holtmann. You have the concept of you have three concepts: industrial breadwinner masculinity, then eco-modern masculinity, and was it ecological masculinity? So you still have this kind of categories of masculinity that you play with. How is your reaction? Would you be able or willing to give up these categories, especially this ecological masculinity, and not see taking care of nature in terms of gender? What is your reaction?
Yeah, so in theory, I totally agree with Bob and others who doesn't want to speak about masculinity, or rather think of masculinity as something that is unnecessary to speak about, or even non-helpful to speak about. So in theory, I agree. But in my empirical work, I see how individuals recognize themselves in connection to the types of identities in which is connected to the sexual identity. And in that empirical analysis, I can kind of get a feeling for how this is very important not to leave out for quite many people. As I said, in theory, I'm not attached to or think of ecological masculinities as something that will solve every problem in the world. I think that the most important is to foster a feminist ethic of care, as Bob pointed out, and other ecofeminists pointed out for a long time. But I do think that in praxis, the way in which people recognize themselves could then be, this concept could be a bridge to actually foster this feminist ethic of care in all humans.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. I see your point. But now we have started to talk about practice. And let's continue with this issue. Who should take the initiative in making men care more about the environment? All of you work in different organizations that in different ways can influence how men think and act. So you could all have something to say here. And perhaps we start with Marina again. You work in the European Commission to make sure that gender perspective and equality perspective is integrated into all major EU policies and initiatives. So what is EU doing in this regard? What is Commission doing?
Thanks, Marianne. Well, I work for the Director General for Climate Action, and there I am the person that participates in the Task Force on Equality. So we work in trying to, on the one hand, make sure that the sectorial perspective in this case, from the perspective of climate policy, is considered in the general policy for equality, but also that we mainstream gender, in this case, in climate policy. So it is more focused in climate policy in terms of mainstreaming. And well, as you probably all know, the European Union has a clear target, or has put climate change on the top of the agenda, and wants to change Europe to make it a society where there's net zero emissions by 2050. And to do that, the Commission produced the European Green Deal, that is the action plan towards that. And this is a challenging goal where we need everyone on board, including men. We need to change how we produce, how we consume, how we move, how we heat or cool our houses, how we work, absolutely everything. So it needs changes, not only structural, also behavioral changes. So to the extent that we need men on board, and the behavior of men and their attitudes needs to change so that they contribute to this goal, we are aiming to change that. And the main policy within the European Green Deal to contribute to this behavioral change is the Climate Pact. It's a new policy that will be launched by the Commission mid-November. It aims to give a platform to everyone to contribute to this common goal and create broad engagement in climate action. And I want to highlight how special this policy is, because up to now the institutions have traditionally shied a bit away of tackling the issue of behavioral change. And this is new in large part in response to citizens and activism, so it's good that the institutions respond to that. And the initiative is an ongoing one. Once it is launched, the idea is that is created bottom up, and there's lots of discussion with society. It is to engage society, and it's not supposed to be something that is just designed from Brussels. So what will be published in November is more of a declaration of intent, and all of these events like this will be also useful in the future to define the activities that happen afterwards. And in 3 ways shortly of how it is going to work, to explain maybe how we could consider this perspective of gender equality and men's behavior. Shortly, the Climate Pact will aim to create a conversation about climate change, to raise awareness and build understanding based on science. Also to trigger action, of course. There will be the possibility to pledge action in the fight against climate change and protection of the environment, and it will create spaces for everyone to interact and work together and also build capacity. And so in this context, we can consider this perspective of men's behavior towards environmentally friendly activities and goals in the way that we organize these discussions, in how we choose role models and leaders, and how we formulate our messages and which solutions we propose. Because there's also a context of not only attitudes towards the environment of men and women that are different, but also more specific in terms of how we transport, how we move, where we work, and all of this should be considered. And just to give 2 examples of things that could be done or that we're working to possibly do as activities towards engaging men. One of them is the possibility of engaging high-level sports associations to pledge environmental friendly behaviors that will hopefully engage more men. Something to reflect on based on the first question, if we are in that sense just rebranding environmentally friendly behaviors in a way that is just associated to masculinity, strength and dominance, and it is not the ways to go. But we have seen that it also works in engaging men. So we also need to take into account the urgency and that action needs to happen now. And maybe there's like that third way around it. And then in the Climate Pact, there's also the figure of the ambassadors. There are people that sign up to commit to action pledges and encourage others to act. So in who we encourage to be ambassadors and who become those figures, we can also change how men hopefully influence and encourage more men to participate. So I take the chance to invite all of you to become ambassadors once the Climate Pact is launched. It will be an ongoing initiative, so all participation from now on is very welcome. Please look into when it is launched mid-November.
Thank you for this overview. One question to you. In all these initiatives that you mentioned and in documents, are men and masculinities in any of them explicitly positioned as problematic? Or is it just kind of behind the scenes?
I don't think we're explicit on this. At the end, what we're trying to do is engage all of society, and to the extent that it is necessary to encourage men, we do it, but we do not explicitly mention it as problematic. We are doing a lot of work now with the new Commissioner on Equality to work on gender mainstreaming, but it is true that maybe it is something that is we're working on, or we're starting to work on now more in detail. It's quite recent that there's even a commissioner with a specific self-standing portfolio on equality, dealing strongly with gender, and that we do have this new network dealing with gender. I have only been appointed in this role 9 months ago, so we're working on it. We're starting.
Yeah, good luck with your work. So, what can academia do in this regard? Who would like to start? Perhaps we end with Martin, because Martin already told us about some initiatives in his introductory presentation. But Bob or Katri? Bob, please.
Yeah, as well as being an academic, I'm also an activist, and I've been involved in pro-feminist NGOs for about 40 years now. Organisations like Men Against Sexism and Men Against Sexual Assault. So I'm not only a theorist and an academic, I'm also an activist who's working on the ground with men, and I'm very interested in how we engage men. But I'm reminded by there's a comment that James Baldwin once said. He said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I find that a really inspiring comment. And it seems to me that as men, we can never be part of the solution until we recognise that we're actually part of the problem. And so I'm really interested in how we engage men to recognise how much we're part of the problem. So I'm interested in the way in which we become complicit in perpetuating patriarchy. And for me, the strategies are that we have to educate men to the realisation that patriarchy exists and it's intersectional with capitalism and colonialism and other unequal structures, that all of us as men are part of it, and that we perpetuate it. And if we want to be part of the solution, we have to acknowledge that complicity. We have to understand it, acknowledge our part within it. And so I run what I frame as patriarchy awareness education workshops, inspired by the kind of work that was done around racism education, and the pedagogies involved in anti-racist work, to me, were inspiring when I got involved in them over 30 years ago. And I've adapted a lot of those exercises in racism awareness to patriarchy awareness. I think we need to educate men about patriarchy and how patriarchy not only impacts on women and children and non-human species and the planet, but how it impacts on men as well, and how we embody it within our psyche and our subjectivity. So I think that until we come to terms with our complicity and recognise how we are part of the problem, I don't think we can move forward.
Kadri?
Yeah, so also a little bit from the university perspective or side. So I'm affiliated with 3 organizations, and 2 of which are universities. And as we know, universities overall are not really like aiming to, strive for social change. And often there's kind of skepticism towards mixing academic work with activism, particularly here in Estonia, I witnessed that. So universities can be quite conservative places. But of course, this is challenged by feminist and gender studies and critical studies on men and masculinities, as well as critical animal studies. So all those fields in which I work in. So I think there are pockets within universities where we are doing such work towards transformation, mainly in the form of projects or research of some scholars. And one example is the kind of project I'm working in at the University of Helsinki, which I mentioned yesterday in my talk too, where we are kind of studying a cultural change towards more sustainable ways of eating, and really gender is a key element in that. And so my own research definitely has always some activist element in it. So, and I also try as much as possible to introduce my findings in activist spaces as well, and in the mainstream media, and not to confine them only to academic settings, like to kind of get it out there to have more impact. And also, so this concerned the kind of my work in at the university, but I'm also involved with the Estonian Vegan Society, where we are then promoting veganism to address this current lack of care towards other animals and the environment. And we have not specifically done so far campaigns that are directed at men. So we haven't really kind of thought through that element. And I think such campaigns would need to be really thought through, because often campaigns directed to a particular gender, for example, men, I think there's a danger of reproducing gender stereotypes in assuming what men are supposed to want and like, and we have witnessed this quite a lot, unfortunately. There are many examples of such campaigns directed at men. For example, the organization, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, are kind of known for their such sexist and provocative campaigns that encourage men to go vegan, but at the same time, the ads that they have there are objectifying women and their bodies for the animal rights cause. So I think this kind of NGO work, and it really needs to be thought through. But yeah, more generally, and kind of who should take initiative and how it should happen. It's really like, as a sociologist here, I'm always saying that we should look at the number of actors on different levels. So there's always that interaction between like institutional level, institutional change, and individual action, and they have to kind of interact for us to achieve any kind of change. And so it's important to kind of change men's everyday gender practices and the way that men relate to the environment. But at the same time, also like we need change in the institutions, like the education system, in government policies, gender equality policies, as well as, from my point of view, cutting subsidies to meat and dairy producers would help. So it needs to be like work on different levels simultaneously.
Yeah, you're quite right about the different levels, individual as well as organizational and structural level needing to go hand in hand. Martin, you mentioned a leadership training conducted by Chalmers University and civil society. Are these trainings popular?
Yes, they are. They are self-selected trainings, and they are run by civil society. It's a permaculture garden outside of Stockholm. It's the organization Men for Gender Equality that has been working with these issues for gender equality for 30 years and bringing in environmental issues the last 5 years or so. We have been running them since 2016, and as I said, they are self-selected. Around 120, 130 men has been taking part of it. We have also done online workshops with the global organization Men Engage, with around 200 participants. And there's a lot of interest from women's groups. Just lately, it was 20 minutes on science radio in Sweden. And there has been a number of mass media articles about this. So yes, there is a large interest. But could I just say some kind of word of cautious and some critical response?
Yes. Welcome, please do.
Yeah, I want to raise the issue that Marina brought up of promoting high-level sportsmen dealing with environmental issues. And maybe this is an example that we need to think through, because we know that not for at least professional football, the last 15 years is totally drenched in oil money from the Saudi Arabia, from the Gulf countries, from Russia. And professional football, not least Premier League, is one of the perpetrators of the slow violence against our planet and us as humanity. So this highlights kind of the problematic of bringing forward persons as leaders on these issues from these type of industries. And I also want to say a word of cautions from the history. So there has been a movement called the mythopoetic men's movement. Yeah. Men going out to the forests and kind of with different practices trying to strengthen in their way and their thinking, their masculinity, their hegemonic masculinity. This has been very successful, and they have totally lost not been engaged with gender equality issues, and neither broader and bigger environmental issues. So nature has just been kind of a backdrop for their raising their hegemonic masculinity. So that's a dead end as well. And I also want to give a big word of caution because we are also seeing a change in the popularity in eco-fascist thinking and practices nowadays. So there is research on the Nordic resistant movement, for example, done by a PhD student at Örebro and Davik, and that's also something to look out for, because the history of the fascist movement has been to actually use various nature practices in their ideology, and that is coming back now. And all these three things, I would just highlight a bit of word of caution and critique.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin, for your notes. We will now take the final question before we move to workshop and start communicating with the audience. So this is a classical question, classical eco-feminist question. Do you think that men's non-oppressive relationships with the nature would bring about the end of men's violence towards women and other men, and even spark equality between genders? So this is something that Kadri's research on vegan men suggested. My own research into Estonian eco-villages and how masculinity is constructed there was a bit more ambivalent in this regard, that men, while taking care of nature and taking new lifestyles, they still strive to create hierarchies and dominance, perhaps a bit differently than men in the mainstream society, but still. So should we be hopeful? Who would like to start? Kadri, you are smiling.
Yes, I mean, I could start, yeah, because I addressed some of these issues today, and I definitely gave quite an optimistic picture, I realized, and I did have some kind of words of caution too, but maybe I would like to expand on that more now. So I think we can certainly make these aspects compatible in men's individual practices, and we have already witnessed that in the case of some men, like the men in my research who saw gender equality and care for non-human animals and the environment as intertwined. But then you had this question of really, would this lead to kind of ending men's violence towards women and the end of patriarchy? Like, well, these are huge structural issues, and this is we have to be, I think, here quite careful and cautious. And I'm not so sure if this will kind of directly lead to these fundamental changes in gendered power relations. And there's also evidence to suggest that, you know, we know that masculinities are changing, and what we are seeing in a way more and more is that hegemonic masculinity is increasingly incorporating some of these elements. Like on the one hand, we see some ways of doing gender differently. For instance, in like workplaces, you know, workplace cultures are transforming. Me Too has been really helpful here, and so sexual harassment is no longer as acceptable as it used to be, including by men. And on the other hand, we also see that men are incorporating elements of kind of environmental sustainability, like recycling or such practices in their lives. And so we are witnessing some of these positive developments, but then we have to be like really vigilant and careful not to declare that now these masculinities are fully transformed and egalitarian. And here I'm pointing out particularly the work of Tristan Bridges and C.J. Pascoe, who have used this concept of hybrid masculinity, where they are saying that, you know, we're witnessing particularly white Western privileged men incorporating these elements of marginalized masculinities into their own ways of doing masculinity, but it doesn't automatically mean that we're moving towards greater gender equality. So it's kind of doubtful that these men would somehow lose their social power or their kind of material position in the social hierarchy by incorporating such practices. So we kind of like have to be careful and notice we may be seeing gender inequalities persisting or manifesting themselves in new ways. And actually we do have here quite staggering examples of how there are individual men and groups of men who on the one hand have dedicated themselves to causes such as animal rights or environmental protection, but on the other hand, they contribute to gender inequalities or racism and white supremacy. Martin's example was actually of the Nordic resistance movement. I was going to also bring that example as such a quite a striking contradiction. And then also we have got examples of how there are some prominent like male leaders of US animal rights organizations who have been accused of sexual harassment of female activists. So like all this is sort of happening at the same time. So yeah, kind of to summarize, so we may be witnessing some alternative ways of doing masculinity that seem to be supporting gender equality and environmental sustainability, but it doesn't automatically translate to like a transformation in gender relations and leading towards more gender equal societies.
Yeah, thank you, Kadri. Now we are very quickly ending our time span given to us. So 1 minute to each of you for your final words, but unfortunately not to Kadri. So perhaps we start with Marina and then Bob and Martin.
Thanks. I guess my last minute goes to encourage further these kinds of debates that are very useful for policymakers. We're very happy to get any critical comments that will make, in the end, the policy more effective to achieving our goals. And I think we're only starting now to really work on, well, we have done it before, work on gender mainstreaming, but put more work into it now and consider these aspects of our policies. So it's something that we're happy to get all contributions to, and I think in this regard the new policy of the Commission, the Climate Pact, is a great frame for that, because it is supposed to be a bottom-up policy that will be co-created with citizens. So I would want to encourage everyone, especially the panelists and those listening to this panel to participate and contribute to working together.
Yeah, thank you. Bob? 1 minute.
Yeah, I just want to affirm all the things that Kadri said, and for those very reasons, these are the reasons why I'm concerned about the focus on reconstructing masculinity, which is not to say that we don't need to bring about change and transformation in men. We absolutely do, but I think the kind of transformation that's required is, as I was saying before, a recognition of our complicity and how we're accomplices and part of the problem. But also, and I think this is where COVID provides us with an opportunity. It provides us with an opportunity to come to terms with our ontological vulnerability. Because until we can acknowledge and recognise our ontological vulnerability, even among those of us who are most privileged as men, while we continue to present ourselves as invulnerable, we won't be connected to and empathic to the vulnerability of others, and we won't recognise the global catastrophe we're all facing. So I think we have to transform the subjectivities of men, but not towards a new form of masculinity.
Thank you. And now to Martin.
Yeah, I'm always a bit cautious about forecasts and what we can hope for. I'm thinking a lot with Joanna Macy's idea of active hope. Hope in that aspect is not something that we should wait for or that we can forecast or judge what will happen. Hope is something that is in the actions and that we do on everyday basis for the common good. And I think that the climate justice movement by Greta Thunberg and others can really embody that type of hope and active hope.
Thanks. Luckily, we haven't finished in a sense that we're going to have questions from the audience via workshop. So please, Jay, moderate this. Floor to you.
Yes, so the most popular question seems to be, if hegemonic masculinity reflects power relations intrinsic to capitalism, to what extent can we change this masculinity in a more sustainable direction without changing our economic system?
A very interesting one. So you seem to be worried. So Bob, please start.
Well, yes, I mean, I don't, clearly from what I was saying before, I don't think we can. I don't think we can reconstruct and transform hegemonic masculinity without transforming not only capitalism, but patriarchy and colonialism and how these structures are all intersected. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is that we need to recognise global warming and climate change themselves as forms of structural violence, structural gendered violence perpetrated by corporate men. And we, until we recognise that and face that, transforming and changing individual masculinities, I don't think is going to take us very far.
Do you all agree, or does someone want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to add, and I definitely agree. I think that this connection is really deep between hegemonic masculinity and capitalism, and you can't, like, you can't really kind of change things without challenging capitalism. And also in the context of my own research, I pointed out how, you know, this kind of veganism, we see this from my point of view, it's a very beneficial practice. We can help alleviate the suffering of animals, but at the same time, it is also a niche form of consumption, which is supporting the capitalist system, and it is available mostly then to Western privileged people. So that's also something that really hugely worries me. And at the same time, when we're thinking of capitalism, then the animal industries, the huge industries which generate a lot of profit and do one of really huge environmental damage. So they are actually overwhelmingly run by Western white men. So there's also that connection, and the masculinity and capitalism here are really intertwined.
Do we take the next question, or you, Martin, want to add something?
I agree, but sometimes I think that the concept of capitalism can be specified and connected to different laws and economic exchanges and values, so that this system that we're living in could be also more easily defined and changed by those parts that we can call the capitalist system or the fossil fuel capitalism system that Andreas Malm has pointed out.
Marlene and Siim.
Yes, we have quite a few more questions. One of them goes, do you think a more equal sharing of power between men and women would help tackle climate challenges?
Marina, perhaps you have a comment on it?
Yes, I think this is also in line with the previous point. The more we learn how to expand care to different groups, independent of race, sex, species, then the more we can care also about nature. So I would agree.
Bob, please.
Yeah, look, I think there is, in some ways, I think that gender equality itself has been co-opted and depoliticised, and it's become part of a neoliberal frame in and of itself. I mean, in Australia, where we have high levels of gender inequality, our government agencies around the prevention of violence will talk about the drivers of gender inequality and how if we created more gender equality, we would address the issue of gender violence. And yet, as we all know so well, that in the Nordic countries where we have much higher levels of gender equality than in other parts of the globe, we still have high levels of gendered violence. And so gender equality itself, I think, has become framed within a neoliberal kind of mindset. And really, it's become a framing in terms of women becoming equal to men, framed within corporate capitalist institutions. And until we recognise that gender equality itself has now been co-opted, I think we're going to be limited and constrained.
Martin?
I can refer to the research of Annika Kronsell on the transport system in Sweden. They have researched all the municipalities in Sweden in a paper just published in Norma. they show there that yes, gender equality can play a role if we're just counting heads within municipalities who are dealing with transport issues, and then in climate change issues and sustainability issues. But it's not the only factor. So it is about traditions, it's about that specific place, that municipality, and the laws, and who has been doing the work beforehand. So it doesn't transfer. Gender equality doesn't transfer easily into sustainability or action on climate change.
Okay, quite pessimistic view. Marlene, do we have more questions? Or
we do. Some of those topics were probably already discussed, but then again, this question was just upvoted, so I'm going to ask it anyway. How do gender stereotypes contribute to different attitudes of women and men regarding climate issues? What can be done about that?
Yeah, well, a very simple question. I've started with it.
We can take another one.
No. It's fine if it was upvoted. It means that it needs to be, Katri.
So I had a little bit of a connection problem. So could you maybe repeat, or did I understand it? The question was, how do gender stereotypes contribute to climate action or?
Yeah, behavior towards the nature and lifestyles.
Well, I mean, they definitely do, as we know from statistical information, that men on average eat more meat, and they are more reluctant to recycle or do some other things. So that definitely is there, and if we could somehow challenge those stereotypes and lessen gender equality, and maybe we wouldn't see such big sort of changes. But then I wanted to connect this to the last question, where I had a small comment. So I don't actually think that, and maybe agreeing with the others, that if we achieve gender equality, or if power is shared between men and women more equally, that it would definitely contribute to better climate outcomes. So if both men and women, or if women are sort of also adopting kind of masculine values and practices, then we would actually be headed towards a world where the condition of our climate would be worse. For instance, women also getting into car cultures as much as men are, or eating similar amounts of meat. So we would actually end up in a kind of a really bad place. That also connects them with the gender stereotypes.
In different ways, it seems. Bob, please continue.
Well, one of the questions I often ask men is, when do you most feel like a man? Do you feel like a man at every waking moment? Do you feel like a man as soon as you wake up in the morning? Do you feel like a man in particular context? When do you most feel like a man? Or do you always feel like a man? Or are there some contexts in which you're less conscious of your gendered subjectivity than in others? And I find it's a really interesting question to ask men. And as men start to think about it and reflect upon it, they also realise that in fact they don't have to feel like men all the time. They don't have to always affirm their masculinity, affirm their gendered subjectivity. And in fact, sometimes they can actually be free of it. And wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't it be great if we as men could stop having to feel all the time that we have to affirm our masculinity? It's a good question to ask men, good question to get men to think about how our gendered subjectivity shifts. And the more you can recognise that it shifts, then the more you can loosen our connection to it. And that's what I see as what we need to be trying to do.
Yeah, we do have many identities, not only gender identity. Yeah.
Indeed.
Marina, please.
Yes, Marianne, if I may, of course, Kari has already pointed out the differences in the behavior that contribute. And I think there's also a general one. It is men's sensitivity to risk and health issues that I think then contributes to all of these other behaviors. If your perception of risk and of health issues is lower as men, then they tend to, of course, then give less value to attitudes that will contribute to improving the general health or address general risks for the population. And also to add, as Kadri also made the point of the previous question, maybe a more positive outlook on how gender equality would contribute to a more sustainable society. There has been research done in, actually a very broad research in lots of constituencies around the world and parliament. And the conclusion is that where there's parliaments that have a higher percentage of women, or also in terms of committees participating in lawmaking, the results are stronger laws in terms of the environment and climate change. So in that sense, I would argue that a more equal society would lead to addressing these issues more. And also, I think if women in general, though it can change or could change, as Kadri was pointing out, depends on how women are included in the workforce in all these areas. But if we're usually more sensitive to these risks and the health of others and take positions in those companies and different areas that can make a change, like all of the sciences and technologies, then I would argue that it would also probably tend to influence the decisions of the corporations towards more sustainable ones.
Okay. May I have the last question? So, do you think that the current COVID epidemic has brought men closer to nature, or made them more concerned about the nature and changed their behaviors on a longer run? Kadri, please.
Yeah, so the COVID crisis obviously is gendered in many ways, and just I pointed out earlier about the kind of perception of risk that men perceive towards getting COVID and all that. But I think what we saw, and maybe that's really temporary, kind of a sharp decline in some pollutive industries. So the industries that are led largely by men. So people moved less, they consumed less. We had reports of air becoming clearer and cleaner in many cities. So it has had that has had a more positive impact on people's health amidst all this chaos and what people have been experiencing. So there is a sort of here some potential for us to rethink as societies what are our consumption needs and practices. But I think too often we have been hearing this question, like, when can we return to normal life, you know? And I find this really disturbing. So that kind of desire to return to an unsustainable normality instead of rethinking our ways of life and harmful practices and how they are gendered. So I think particularly largely our male political leaders are really seeing this situation as a kind of temporary deviation from normality, which should resume after the crisis. But I think we can no longer be the same as we were before this. So maybe one thing that is a bit positive that has started to change, and I hope will remain changed, is that we have started to notice and value care and care work more through the efforts of the frontline workers and nurses, teachers, and so this is particularly like feminized work, and maybe that will be sort of valued, continue to be valued more, and maybe men also will kind of orient themselves towards that a bit more, but I'm sort of ambivalent about this kind of potential of COVID to fundamentally change our ways of life. Yeah.
Bob, you want to add?
I think too. Yeah, I think too that our male political leaders have either been cavalier about the virus in terms of minimising the risk, or we've waged a war against the virus, and we've used the military metaphor as a war. And I remember even when the UK Prime Minister Johnson came out of hospital after he'd had COVID, talked about the virus as an invisible mugger that he had now wrestled to the floor. And so this kind of way of thinking of the virus as something we need to wage a war against is part of the problem. The opportunity the virus presents us is to think about how we are entangled with nature. And to come to the realization that if we destroy nature, and if we kind of contribute to the deforestation and the movement of animals from out of their own environments into connection with humans, and the viruses pass over, then we can actually get it that the virus is a warning call. It's a warning call that if we're concerned about human health, we have to be concerned about planetary health and the health of our non-human species. I really, really hope that we can get that message, because I think it's so fundamentally important.
Thank you, Bob. I think that these were the words that we ended our panel with, because our time is up. So thank you, panelists. It was an interesting discussion, and see you soon.